Hello, my dear friends. Thank you for being with us here now. This beautiful event is a homage to Allan Kardec's birthday, and the world is in a big party today with our joy, gratitude to God that we are sharing this event with you all. We have here our Dr. Mick Collins, Natalie, Tobert, Dr. Alexander Moreira. They will be in charge of this event. Mick will be the first to talk, and Natalie will introduce you both. But first of all, I would like you to be in 1 minute of silence and dedicate your thoughts to the world's peace, so we can be with our dear masters of love, our divinity, that is helping us to tune our minds and welcoming our souls to be together, enlightening, listening these talks, and take part in the world to a better moment in the future. So, dear divinity, be with us now and forever. So, thank you all. I hand over now to Natalie to carry on this seminar. Thank you. Thank you, Natalie. Welcome, Mick. Welcome, Alexander. Thank you, Natalie, my dear friend.
Thank you, and welcome to all of you, and welcome to the listeners. We'll start today with Dr. Mick Collins, and I should tell you he is an occupational therapist and a holistic coach and a writer. And then in 2015, he retired from his academic post at the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences in the University of East Anglia. And today he writes and speaks about humanity's transformational and sustainable journey towards an improved future. Dr. Mick, would you like to carry on?
Thanks, Natalie. Great to be here, everyone, on this auspicious day, 216 years since Allan Kardec was born, which is great to be talking about Kardec. And I'm going to be mentioning a little bit about Carl Jung as well today. And so I've titled my talk, Jung and Kardec, Spiritual Evolution and the Co-Creation of an Improved Future. To not understand that we're in a state of global crisis. There's a planetary emergency, and people are, waking up to that fact. The big question then is, what will we do? How will we move through this time of crisis as something productive? And I was quite taken with the idea that when you read Kardec, you see that he locates this time that we're in as a period of moral growth, which I think is already an interesting underlying premise for where I'll be going in the talk later today. But Jung also, I remember reading Max Zeller, who was a Jungian analyst, I think from Berlin, who came to Jung and presented him with a dream of a temple. He dreamt of a temple being built, a vast temple, just beyond the dimensions were just phenomenal. And all people from around the world were working on this temple. And he presented that to Jung, and they had a conversation about it, more than analysis. And Jung said, yes, I've come across this type of process in other people's dreams. And he said to Zeller that this is indicative of a new humanity, a new position in humanity. He called it the New Jerusalem. And it gives us an idea of this kind of new spiritual age that we're heading into. So we're in a time of volatility, crisis, and all sorts of meltdowns with the planet, social disintegration, ecological degradation. And yet, these two pillars of science and philosophy are giving us some real indications that there's a point of moral growth collectively and a new Jerusalem. Jung said that this temple will take 600 years to build. Now, I don't know quite where he got that from, but I think what he's referring to is that this is an epoch. this is a new era, and they don't just happen overnight. They take time. So I'm talking a little bit today about Jung and Kardec, and Joan Cos-Chioino, who's a medical anthropologist from South America. She has done some work already on uniting those two worlds, the world of Kardec and the world of Jung. And she would say that the spiritist perspective would be that often people would have to deal with intrusions, spiritual intrusions and disturbances, and to get to grips with that kind of process. And so she then matches that in a Jungian context with people meeting their inner complexes. These are processes that have gone unconscious, but they're having their effect. And the idea of doing the inner work, which can be quite debilitating, is to wake up to those complexes. And in both the Spiritist and the Jungian perspective, they are the points for growth and they are the points for awakening. But I think where I'd like to go a little bit further with Jung and Kardec is in relation to the shadows, because I think this is quite a useful, particularly at this time. If you look at politics, social sort of news that's going on, and ecological issues that are arising, you'll see the shadow being played out. There's us and them and othering, and there's all sorts of processes happening around that which are quite complex. But if we understand that the shadows are basically unconscious, we're unaware of them, and they're unprocessed, so they just are free to run in our lives, and they cause polarizations and they get projected. So if we understand the shadow from that perspective, we've got some real opportunities then to do some work on that. And Jung, I believe, I'm going to make a distinction now between, we know that there's the personal shadow and the collective shadow. This is what Jung said. People have their own personal shadows to deal with. So that could be all sorts of societal introjects, ideas that just don't fit with this life this person wants to live. And basically that shadow festers away inside the person. But there's also the collective shadow. And we see that particularly in very difficult political movements. We saw it in Nazi Germany. There's a collective shadow that got mobilized very quickly. But where I want to make a distinction today is that I want to locate Jung's idea of the shadow as the incarnate shadow. Here's the shadow in our incarnation, in this life, this earthly existence. And as a way of making a distinction, I want to sort of speak about Kardec's. He doesn't use the term shadow. I mean, although the word with Chico Xavier comes up, the word umbral comes up, which is a kind of a shadow land. But I want to talk about the disincarnate shadow from a Kardecian perspective. And the idea that, again, which would be a personal, a soul or a spirit when it passes over, if it hasn't worked on its shadows in its earthly existence, those migrate over at death. Now, is there a collective shadow at death? Well, I would say the umbral is a vibrational sphere, which we could say is a collective shadow. So in a way, those two parallel very nicely. The individual and collective shadow that we have on earth and the unprocessed shadows that propel us into the umbral if we haven't worked on our stuff, or if we're over-invested in hatred or things like that. So there's a real impetus with the incarnate shadow and the disincarnate shadow to wake up. And really, in a way, both Jung and Kardec are really speaking about waking up. So this is a really great opportunity for us to delve into this a little bit. And one of the methods that Jung used for waking up is inner work. So the classic therapist position would be to work with the client and to help them to enter into their inner world, to look at the dynamics, the things that are split and the things that are seeking wholeness. And I'm going to speak about some dreams in this talk a little bit later, just to give you some illustrations of how these shadows play out. But one of his principal methods was active imagination. So where this works really well is if, for instance, we have a impulse in us that is less than good, let's say, an unsavory impulse. We don't have to act that out. With Jung's ideas, we can actually start entering into that process, and then we can start to look at what is this figure representing if it was in a dream, or if it's in a fantasy or a vision. What does this figure represent? And then we can bring up other oppositional positions and start to interact. That's a dialectical procedure. And Jung said between two positions, when they interact, a third position pops up. So there's awareness. That's where we can start to wake up. Now, Kardec, in terms of waking up, so Jung gives us an inner work and a methodology for that. Kardec gives us an absolute brilliant moral position. It's moral work. So inner work and moral work. And that moral work is often influenced by the idea of serving others, so that we're not just self-serving, we're serving others for the greater good. And so already you can start to see where Jung would inform Kardec's work and vice versa, because the social, the psychological, the political, and the ecological at this moment in time are all coming together, and they are colliding and seeking some type of resolution. So our work, should we choose to take it on, if we're interested in becoming whole and conscious, is to actually do that work. And I'm very taken with the idea as well that Jung's idea of individuation, becoming a whole person, you find parallels with that in Kardec's work. He talks about wholeness. And so these two methodologies, whilst they might appear on the surface quite different, because it took Jung a long time to get interested in reincarnation. There are intimations in his work about karma, and I'll mention a few of those in a minute. And for Kardec, he talks about reincarnation and karma. Now, at first look, they don't look like those two worlds fit, Jung and Kardec. But in fact, Jung started to come towards reincarnation after one of his colleagues had a dream. He dreamt of one of his colleagues, and he had repeat dreams about this person. And eventually, he basically started to realize that there was some suggestion that reincarnation does happen by virtue of the dreams that he was having. He didn't go into any details about those dreams, but that started to change his opinion about what was going on in terms of the afterlife, after this earthly life. So one of the things then so having laid that out, I think I'm laying out the territory. I think Kardec and Jung are actually quite suited for us going forward with this idea that we've got a lot of work to do in this incarnation and in preparation for the next. So I think those two are quite useful bedfellows in helping us on that path. One of the words, Jung, I mentioned, used the word individuation to become whole. And one of the words I quite like is soul progression. And I think that fits more with Kardec in a sense. But, we find some really interesting thoughts from Jung, particularly in his writings on death, where he says that he spoke about the journey of the soul after death. So he really had this sense that something isn't just extinguished at the end of our physical earthly lives. And it must be remembered as well that he had a near-death experience himself, and it was quite a profound one. And it really did change a lot of his thinking, I believe. So, we've got this idea of the soul progressing after death from a Jungian perspective. But from Kardec, we get some very clear from the spirits that were informing his work. And I'm going to paraphrase this quote because it's, I'm just going to say it as it's landed in my head. But one of the quotes that I love after reading Kardec, paraphrased, is the robes we wear in this life are the robes that we will wear in the next. So whatever we are creating in our thoughts, actions, and all those interactions that we're involved with, if they're actually for the greater good, then actually that improves our position after this life when we're in another realm, whichever one that's going to be. But there's something about the idea. What I loved in that quote too is that is the smart person will not only weave those robes but keep them clean, which means there's again that moral duty, that sense of morality in here. That this is not just about consciousness, this is about conscience. And so Jung would be very much tied to consciousness, whereas Kardec is very much tied to conscience. But those two fit beautifully. They have a similar root meaning in the word, is to know. Consciousness and conscience, the root meaning is to know. So there's something about knowing this journey to wholeness and what we're invested in. So then thinking about that, those actions, the robes we weave in this life become the ones we wear in the next. And actually, while you're weaving them, keep them in good order. Don't let things go all over the place. There's an implicit karmic link to that, obviously. And I was quite excited when I came across Jung when he said in his writings, "When I die, my deeds follow me." Now, if that isn't some implicit connection to karma, then I don't know what is. But where that gets really mapped out very helpfully by Kardec is he speaks then about justice. And of course, we have the law of, when we've done things, that things come back to us. So there's a sense of justice in that. And for Kardec, what I like, where it complements Jung's work, is "When I die, my deeds follow me." Well, for Kardec, it's that each soul is responsible for its actions. So, there's no good saying, "Oh, I had a tough time there, and that's what's to really blame for me being such a difficult or bad person or something." Well, those tough times we had could be the lesson that we needed to wake up and to work through that level of atonement, to prepare ourselves for the next part of our soul journey beyond this life. So for me, what I love about Kardec in particular, in terms of awareness, is that he's actually preparing us to avoid future regret. And this is really important because we get a real sense of the difficulties that can manifest after we've passed away, should we be open to these ideas. And we get some real sense of that in Jung as well, because in his red book, in the footnotes, at one of the pages, he wrote about the lament of the dead. So it means he was aware that there's this field of lamentations with the spirits that are living, in distress. And there's one beautiful story I want to illustrate that with in a minute. I'm just going to have a quick drink. And the story comes from the Geronticon, which is it's a collection of sayings from the monks of Mount Athos. And they're written by some very sincere and quite austere spiritual practitioners, and there's some wonderful stories in there. And basically, this story is about a farmer who lived next to a monastery. And this monastery had an olive grove. And this farmer decided that he quite liked the look of one of these trees. Now, I don't know how he did it, but I think he stole an olive tree. And it doesn't explain how that happened, but my only guess is that he reconfigured the boundary between his land and the monk's land, and somehow the tree ended up in his orchard. So that would have been a very productive, over the course of a lifetime, this farmer would have got a lot of oil and a lot of money from that tree over the course of his lifetime. And then he died. And when the farmer died, a month after he died, his son started having repeat dreams. one after the other, night after night, of his dad being in real distress, saying, "My soul is not at peace, help me." And then he gave his son an instruction to take 2 big flagons of olive oil to the monks as a gesture of reconciliation, and then to give them the tree back. Now, the son obviously was quite sensitive to his father's plight, and there are many people today who would say, "Oh, it's just a dream, I'll let it go." But if you've got sensitivities to the fact that there are people who've passed over and they're maybe in a state of distress and they can't move on because of some difficult thing that happened, imagine then if you started to dream and you might take that seriously. And thankfully the son did. I would do as well, to be honest. The son took it seriously. And so he turned up at the monastery with these massive, great flagons of oil and then atoned for his father's past misdeeds. Now, it doesn't say this in the story, but my only sense of this is that the monks would have said thank you and they would have prayed for that soul, and I suspect that would have helped that soul to move on. So there's something about restoration, not only in life, and unburdening ourselves of the things we've done that have not been easy is a useful thing to do. That's where therapy helps. And Jung said that the confessional is a good thing. He wasn't against that. And in a way, therapy is a bit like that. But what happens for those that don't have that experience or that tradition to rely on, who are then trapped in the umbral, in that place of real pain and difficulty, when they understand that they could have done better and they want to improve, but there's no opportunity. We understand from reading Kardec and Chico Xavier and Divaldo Franco that actually there is work to be done on the other side, but it's a lot harder. I mean, when you have a material world, you can give material gifts, you can make material offerings, you can do all sorts, you can be of service to people. When you're in the spirit world, your good acts are going to be trying to help and raise the spirits of another one. I remember reading that, I think it's in No So La by Chico Xavier and Andreas Lutz. I think that's how you spell it. I don't know exactly. But what we're seeing in that dream, if we took Jung seriously, is non-locality. So the idea then that we're living in an interconnected field of consciousness, and just because somebody's passed away, it doesn't mean to say they can't come into our dream life and help inform us. If anyone's ever heard of the great Saint Padre Pio, he had experiences like this too. If there's room, I'll talk about that story in a bit, but it's a really marvelous story about a spirit coming back and asking for a particular mass to be said for him because of the difficult things he'd done in his life, and Padre Pio obliged. I think there's many ways to go with this, of being in service, not only to our incarnate brothers and sisters, but to our disincarnate brothers and sisters. And so here we are. The non-local world that we live in isn't just for us incarnate beings. It extends to much further than that, to all sort of conscious forms, whether they're incarnate or disincarnate. And we know the amount of suffering that is in the umbral, or the lament of the dead, as Jung said. That lament. If we had a heart, we would say prayers for those beings, and of course that can actually help improve their prospects, even though they are disincarnate. That will help them progress. And so I'll say a little bit about prayer in a minute, that how I'm conceiving it in this talk. But the idea then is, now we're open to this idea, if we get this idea of Jung being sensitive to what comes in our dreaming at a very deep way. I know Kardec wasn't exactly 100% with dreams. He said, oh yes, spirits can come and help us in our dreams, and they are for our emancipation, and that's good. But he wasn't so much into the psychotherapeutic side of things. But in fact, if we look at Jung's work and see some of the work he's done, I think we can say that actually Jung can profit from Kardec and Kardec can profit from Jung, because there's a lot of overlap. And that dream of that farmer illustrates that point. that shows the real link between the two. So what it suggests is we live in this non-local field, this interconnectivity in all the universe that we're in, with all the different realms and vibrational spirits and us on this earth plane that are a part of that. And so there's a spiritual evolution happening. And if we look at that as what Jung brings to that story, of course, that's transpersonal consciousness. And that's the non-local field. So if we had a sensitivity to that, we would think our dreams as not just being some overflow pipe of today's difficult day. No, it could be something far greater than that. And similarly, with Kardec, we get the development of a moral conscience. And so that ways of knowing become much more extended and much more deepened by those two methods, having some sort of coherence between the pair of them. And of course, for Jung, that it's about sacred action. It's about understanding that what we're in is not just doing things just for a nice career. It's thinking much deeper than that. It's about atonement. It's about restoring our spirit. It's about preparing ourselves for future lives. And this is a real journey. And, you know, the work is a big part of that, sacred action. And understanding that karmically, that's part of what we need to happen today in this global crisis. Just think about it for a moment. How many animals are suffering? You know, think of all the animals that were burnt in the forests of Australia and California just this year alone. And Kardec spoke about there will be lots of difficult things starting to happen, volcanoes and all sorts of things happening like that at this time when this time of, what did he call it again? Moral growth comes about. And so I think we're right on that point right now. And you know, the idea of our moral development, thinking for each other, but not only other humans, but other species and nature. All nature is holy. You know, the plants, the animals, other people. And so if we had that approach, and we find this in near-death research, that all nature is holy, all beings are holy, animals, everything. So if we're really going to take this on, we've got some incredible work to do. Rather than polarizing and living in our shadows, let's work on our shadows and make that connection to the global, resolving the global crisis. So it comes down to now how much we're going to invest in what is good and understand what is not so good. And Jung came out with a very powerful statement. He didn't hold his punches, but he said this: you suffer from evil because secretly you love it. And that's a really hard statement to hear, but I think there's a truth in it. And you can see that in the Second World War, when you can see it, you can see it today, but the Second World War really illustrated it, when Hitler just decided to live a very shadowy existence. He mobilized the collective shadow and everybody loved it. Everyone wanted to join this big thing and let's go and attack other people. Not everyone wanted that, but I read some stats once that said about 90% of the population were behind him. You know, why that love of war? Why that love of destruction? We're sitting back and watching the world being destroyed right now. You know, this is a time for real sacred action. So, you know, this is our karmic time. We can't just sit back and have a yawn and read the paper and think, well, it'll be all right, won't it? It probably won't. It needs something else, but that's part of our sacred work. But what I love about Kardec, because whilst Jung put in the big punch, Kardec said this: understanding evil is the first step towards amendment. So both Jung and Kardec understood that good and evil exists within each of us. We all have that potential. And I'm very mindful of the fact that when we have our near-death, people who have near-death experiences, when they have the panoramic vision of how their lives played out, they not only feel the consequences and of all the actions they committed, both good and bad, but also feeling the things they could have done but didn't. And that, I mean, I believe that fits with Kardec quite nicely, and I think I've got that right. Sorry. So, you know, this is I'm fairly new to Kardec, so, you know, I'm sort of just catching up with this for the last year, really. But so what's the way out then? What's the method? Not only doing inner work and moral work, but very actively, you find with Jung, prayer is also an issue that he supported. And so he would say, pray to your depths. So he talks about the spirit of the depths. So that means going really deep, getting to understand who you are, working on your complexes, and then making a stance, making a move forward. Pray to your depths. So that's really about becoming whole. Go deep. And he said, it's only the people who understand what is degraded in themselves who are capable of mercy. So it even means we're not all just going to be all lovely and good people. Oh, aren't we all nice? Yes, that's wonderful. But not all of us have been like that. I haven't. I've got a criminal record. And, you know, but it's actually, that's helped me go deeper with actually finding my own point of mercy and compassion and forgiveness for myself and for others. But what I love about Kardec is his prayer sanctifies all of our actions. And what we know from Kardec, and I've read in Tibetan Buddhist literature too, is that prayer isn't just a thought construct that makes you feel good. It's a vibration. It sort of waves out, and it will connect with people. And remember, if we're only invested, according to Kardec and the spirits that informed his work, if we're only invested in that which is degraded in us, we'll attract a swarm of malevolent spirits that will agitate us. And yet, if we work on that shadow in ourselves, so here's where the Jungian work helps, and then work on our moral development, then they can't get a grip on us, and actually they'll be attracted more the angelic, the beings that are capable of helping us. So I'll give you another dream very quickly now. I'm just aware I've got about 10 minutes, I think. And Natalie, you can put something in the chat if you disagree with that. That's my understanding. I thought it was going to be about 3:45. But just to say, there's a dream. Jung did some work with a man who was a businessman, who was a decent chap, but he had a dream of having dirty hands. And he couldn't understand what it meant. So Jung worked with him, and it turned out that he was involved in a very shady deal with somebody else that was improper. And as soon as that became apparent through that dream, the wisdom of that dream, he changed his attitude completely and then cut off the deal. Didn't want to work with these people because there was something about being engaged in that was going to corrupt him. And his dream, his conscience already knew it, but Jung brought his consciousness to that awareness. Now, here's the wonderful thing. Kardec here would fit beautifully, because Kardec would then say, well, the evolution of your moral conscience then is based upon love, service, charity, and justice. So if you're involved in shady deals, that's going to be unjust on someone. It's not very charitable, because invariably somebody's going to be making something out of somebody else's expense. It's not engaged in love. And you know, the idea then is that we are corrupting ourselves, and we know what will happen at the end of our lives if we overinvest in that. And so the premise is to really make the effort to not let those moments pass by. So cleaning our hands, if you wish, and doing our work, and moving forward. So I'm seeing this time that we're in as like a time of I'll call it an archetype of awakening. An archetype is simply something like an original pattern. And that's what Jung would, and Plato also was the originator of that word, but or used that word at least. But Jung saw it as an original pattern. So we've got to go somewhere with this original pattern in thinking about what is it about wholeness and healing that's an original pattern within us that we've neglected and forgotten. And I think Jung brought that to us in terms of our psyche very beautifully. And he brings that to us in this deeply in this earthly incarnation. But remember this, an archetype is a system of readiness for action. And here's where Kardec links to that very powerfully, because again, that's where we're preparing them for successive incarnations. So really, if we're thinking about wholeness and individuation, we can't just think in this lifetime alone. We've got to think about successive incarnations. Then, yeah, I've been told by Natalie 10 minutes is good. Thanks, Natalie. So then if we're looking then at what are we evolving to then? I mean, I've got a sense in this life, I've gone from a pretty difficult start to a reasonably good finish at the end of my career in terms of my opportunities and aspirations and the work I've done. So I can see progress there. What about when I die? What will progress then? What will the movement be? And here's where I love what I read in Chico Xavier's work in No Solar, when he talks about the path to angelhood. And I got very taken with that because I love angels, and I think, you know, this is great. If you think about it here, we've got a wonderful, again, another link to Jung, because Jung understood that the daemon is often within our psyches, within our sort of opportunities. The daemon is like a guide that challenges us and cares for us. It's a bit like a guardian angel, if you wish. And but that daemon, you will find in Jung's work, will often erupt, and it will be it might shake us up a little bit. And so it goes back to Joan Coscioino's idea that sometimes we've got to deal with that intrusion that pops up. Well, the daemon can erupt like that. But actually, the more we master ourselves in that way, then we start to become whole. But if we go with the path of angelhood, that's going way beyond just me as a person. This is like a real enlightenment or emancipation in spirit. This is going far beyond Jung now, I believe. So where I think this is really useful is if I remember reading the monks of Mount Athos again. There's a group of about 12 monks that live on the top of Mount Athos, and there's people who've now been made saints who have seen these beings manifest. They're light beings, and they often have long beards, very little clothing, but they radiate light. And there was a wonderful story of a young monk who saw one of these beings and followed it up the mountain and said, "Can I study with you? Will you be my elder?" And the monk turned around with compassion and said, "You couldn't live where we live. You can only live there by grace, not by effort, only by grace. This is God-given now." But he said, he blessed the young monk and said, "Go back to your elder and prepare yourself." He said, "Because you're going to die soon." So the monk went back down the mountain. It's a true story. This is written in the Geronticon, the book of monks' stories that written by, you know, credible, honest people. This monk went back down and told his elder that he'd seen what they call the invisible monks, the illuminated ones, which is a great blessing. And he told his elder that he'd seen this being, and he said I was going to die. And so they started to get him preparing himself for death. And 3 weeks later, the young monk died. He had aspirations to become an ascetic, but he died 3 weeks after seeing that being. But at his funeral, everybody smelt the fragrance of beautiful flowers, lilies, or whatever flowers they are. But, you know, to my mind, when I think of Chico Xavier's path to angelhood, I use markers like that for saying this is a real possibility for what some human beings have manifested in this lifetime, and imagining how that will go on in successive incarnations. And Elder Paisios, who was one of the saints of Mount Athos, he's met these beings, and he said all they do is pray for the world. Now, I think this is beautiful, and I think it ties in beautifully with Kardec's work, because these are, you know, advanced, enlightened spirits that are with us, and they're not only disincarnate, they're also, well, certainly they're on Mount Athos, and you hear about them also in the Tibetan traditions as well. But just to understand that somehow, you know, if we only took regular science as our benchmark for what is happening in our world, we wouldn't have this conversation. But the fact that people like Kardec have pushed that agenda forward and said, yes, let's open ourselves to this. Let's pray. Let's evolve the path of angelhood, and to do our inner work, to clear the debris of our shadows that are dragging us down. So with that, before I read Kardec in my last book, which is called The Visionary Spirit, I wrote a chapter called Daemonic Fate, Angelic Destiny. And so in some ways, I find it quite interesting that I'm having this conversation today. Daemonic fate, like I said, would be when we meet in this physical incarnation, some of the difficulties that might come up internally or externally. The thing is then is not to collapse, but to then take that as a path, an initiation to go further, and then pick up our spiritual path and evolve and progress our souls. And who knows how far we'll get, but because clearly this is going to be an ongoing and long-term process. But you know, it's quite wonderful to think that actually, you know, if we can put the angelic in the mix, that we're all on that path to angelhood, to, you know, future enlightenment. And, you know, it starts today. It starts with a prayer. It starts thinking about the world that we're living in and what can we do to help and serve, and being charitable and loving and just. And if we can do some inner work on our dreams along the way, then I think we're actually in a good position to help the world productively. Now, I'm very aware that I've got about 2 minutes left, so I think I shall call that an end to the talk, because I think I've said everything I need to say, and possibly we'll have some questions later on after Dr. Alexander's spoken. Great. Is that okay, Natalie?
That's fine, Mick. That's very nice. Thank you for ending on time as well. You definitely score points for that.
Well, I said I always bring one of these with me.
Yes, I've got one too. What I'm going to do, you've raised a lot of points, and I'm going to refrain myself from asking any questions. I'm going to invite the people who are listening, if you have questions that you would like to put to Dr. Mick and Dr. Alexander, would you put them in the comments section? And now what I'd like to do is invite Dr. Alexander to come on screen. Thank you very much. Lovely to see you. So I'm going to ask you if you would talk again for 45 minutes, and then we'll have discussions with the questions raised from both the talks afterwards. So may I introduce Dr. Alexander Moreira-Almeida. He's Associate Professor of Psychiatry in the Research Center of Spirituality and Health in the School of Medicine at the University of in Brazil. You will have to explain that. You're chair of various sections on spirituality and of Latin America, and you're former chair of the section on religion, spirituality and psychiatry of the World Psychiatric Association. Would you like to start your talk? Thank you. Elsa, would you unmute?
Okay. Thank you very much for this opportunity to be here and to share with colleagues some ideas about Kardec, specifically today that we are celebrating Kardec's birthday. Well, let me present my slides, just a minute. Okay. I've try again to find. Okay, I think I will share my. Okay. Okay, I'll share my screen now. Okay, so I have a presentation to present briefly about Allan Kardec and how he developed a research program in psychic experiences that he called it as spiritism. So Allan Kardec was a pioneer in proposing a scientific investigation of psychical phenomena. Some other researchers also proposed this kind of investigation in the 19th century. And the major idea was the use of reason and empirical exploration, scientific exploration, to use these tools to investigate spiritual or psychic phenomena. Based on his studies, he created a word, spiritism, to name a specific spiritual philosophy that he developed based on his studies. Okay, and however, despite spiritism has been quite widespread, not only in Brazil but in many other countries, Kardec's research methods are usually unknown and quite often misrepresented. So the main purpose of my talk now is to present a brief Kardec's biography, and then the first steps in his development of this new research program, and some guidelines of his investigation. And we will focus primarily on primary sources, not in what some other people wrote about Kardec, but actually in what Kardec himself wrote and what are the reports of his own investigation. And basically, we will focus on the 9 books that Kardec published on Spiritism, and also the 12 volumes of Revoix Spirit. Revoix Spirit is a kind of proceedings of Kardec's works, and he published it monthly in the last 12 years of his life. And it describes quite in depth his investigations, his explorations in this field. So briefly, Allan Kardec is a pseudonym, is a nickname. His actual name is Hippolyte Léon Denisard Rivail. He was born in France in 1804, in October the 3rd. So today we are celebrating his birthday, and he died when he was 64 years old, and in Paris. He studied in Switzerland with Pestalozzi. Pestalozzi was considered at that time one of the most prominent educators in Europe, and still today he's a very influential educator. After that period with Pestalozzi, he came back to France and worked for decades, about 3 decades, as educator, writer, and translator. So he wrote 24 texts on education, grammar, arithmetic. He was member of several scholarly and scientific societies in France, and he was also involved with animal magnetism for more than 30 years before being in touch with this kind of spiritual phenomena. And we usually, when we talk about Kardec's biography, we separate his life as Rivail, that is his life before being in touch with Spiritism, and we usually call him Kardec after his contact with mediumistic phenomena. So in these 50 years as Rivail, basically, he was about 50 years old when he started getting involved with mediumistic phenomena. In his life as Rivail, as educator and writer, he emphasized very much the improvement of universal and public education. He was part of this large movement defending universal education for population. He emphasized the free thinking, religious tolerance. He lived in Switzerland with Protestants, Catholics, Jews, and different people from different religious backgrounds, and he saw the importance of religious tolerance. And also, he was a promoter of the use of reasoning and scientific knowledge. Also, at that time, was not fully accepted that the importance of education on science to general population, that regular education, regular universal education should also include scientific education. And he promoted that also. And then, when he was 50 years old, for the first time, he heard about the turntables. Turntables became a quite popular movement in North America and in Western Europe at that period, in the mid of 19th century. And the first time that he heard about turntables, he thought that it could be due to some physical cause. He said, well, if people are together around the table and the table start to move, it could be fraud, but could be some physical force. At that time, science was exploring different kinds of physical force, magnetism, electricity, and things like that. So he thought, oh, it could be some physical force, and he didn't pay too much attention to that. Later, he was told that the tables not only could move, but they could answer questions. And then he said, well, this is a different thing. If it's just moving and if it is answering questions. And in the beginning, he had a quite skeptical answer, as he himself tells in his work, the posthumous work. He said, I will believe it when I see it, and when it has been proved that a table has a brain to think, nerves to feel, and that it can become a somnambulist, can be hypnotized in modern term. Until then, allow me to see nothing in this but a fable told to provoke sleep. So he said, come on, I can't believe that the table can answer questions and things like that. But later, he was convinced by a friend in the next year, a very serious person, a very reasonable person, that Kardec was a friend for many years. And this person said, well, we should attend one of these seances, and because I was impressed. And then Kardec attended for the first time a mediumistic seance in 1855, and he observed table turning and also some rudimentary mediumistic writing. His first approach was Kardec did not accept miracles, meaning some supernatural explanation. Supernatural in the sense of not being ruled by some natural law. He does not equate natural word with material word. Natural word for Kardec means a word ruled by some natural law. So that's that point. So there must be a natural explanation. And then Kardec investigated several hypotheses to explain mediumistic phenomena. This is very important to take into consideration, that Kardec did not accept in the beginning a spiritual cause. He raised several alternative explanations to this phenomenon, to mediumistic phenomena, before accepting a spiritual source for this phenomenon. And it's interesting also to take in consideration that basically he raised the main hypothesis that we still use to explore the explanation for this paranormal mediumistic phenomenon. First is fraud, hallucinations, madness. It could be a physical cause, like some energy, unknown and physical energy. The cracking muscle Michael Faraday, a very important physicist and chemist from UK, raised this hypothesis that there is some muscles that would produce sounds in medium's legs. So this was one explanation. The other explanation would be the devil. The devil would explain everything, or everything would be caused by the Holy Spirit. So he explored all these phenomena. For example, in terms of physical cause, he said the importance of being aware of effects of imagination. And when some extraordinary phenomenon is produced, we first should look for a natural cause. Natural cause in this sense here means a material cause. So we need to try to explain first all these phenomena as material cause, because it's the most frequent and the most probable. Only if we cannot explain that way, we should look for an explanation in other aspects. And so he accepts the possibility that could be a physical cause. He accepts the possibility that could be fraud. But he said that there are some phenomena that could not be explained by fraud, by physical cause. And the best two objections found in a rational basis when we cannot explain in more traditional way, like fraud, like physical cause, are two other explanations that still do not accept the intervention of spirits. The first is what he called somnambulism. Somnambulism at that time meant what we call nowadays a kind of hypnotism, altered states of consciousness. In these altered states of consciousness, the person could produce material from his own unconscious mind. So his own unconscious mind could create visions, could create a discourse, a new personality, a secondary personality. And also, this unconscious activity could be helped by some kind of clairvoyance. Okay? So, as he said, a momentary super excitement of these mental faculties could kept this information through clairvoyance. So this would be one possible explanation. And the second is what he called mental reflection. That what we would call nowadays telepathy. Telepathy was created later by English psycho-researcher Frederick Myers a few years later. So Kardec said that medium could be a sort of mirror reflecting the thoughts, ideas, and knowledge of the sitter, of those around him. So it could be telepathy. So this very frequent hypothesis raised in parapsychology, like clairvoyance, like telepathy, like unconscious mind activity. So he raised all these possibilities, and actually he accepts that these explanations can explain a number of the claimed mediumistic activity. However, he said they could not explain everything. For example, when the mediums expressed thoughts that were alien to the persons present, contradicting their preconceived ideas. Specifically, when the medium exactly produced information that no one present in the seance knew, and information that is veridical. Okay. Another aspect were about some skills, unlearned skills that the mediums did not possess. For example, writing, illiterate mediums writing, and sometimes writing with the handwriting of the deceased, and the medium had never met the deceased or any of his handwritings. Xenography or xenography. That means when the medium can speak in a foreign language that the medium had never learned previously, but the deceased knew that language. So this would be another reason to believe that could not be easily explained just by telepathy, clairvoyance, or unconscious mind activity. When 2 or 3 mediums place their fingers at the same time in the same basket, something similar to what is here in this picture. Different mediums put their fingers in the same basket, and there is a pencil connect to that basket, and then they together write some meaningful words that would be hard to understand how all these people together could synchronize to write at the same moment for a question that was raised at that moment. Also, the similarity of the handwriting and poetry, when, for example, the medium produces poems that are in the same style of the deceased. This is a famous case. There is a famous case in Brazil, Chico Xavier. The first book produced by Chico Xavier, Parnaso de Além Túmulo, or the Anthology from Beyond the Tomb in English, is a collection of dozens of poems attributed to dozens of deceased poets. And there are some important studies in Brazil performed by Alexandre Caroli Rocha, comparing the style and the knowledge displayed in these poems that are very similar to the original poets. And also when the answers produced by the medium are much beyond the knowledge of the medium. So, in addition, these mediumistic communications, they showed a wide range of personal psychological characteristics, like the character, humor, conciseness, choosing of words, likes, dislikes, related to the alleged communicating personality. And these features were not known many times from the medium. So all this experience taken together proved to Kardec that at least in some moments, these communications were actually caused by deceased personalities, because he was able to see that what we consider a personality, a person, that is a continuity of character and memory, and this personality with his or her skills, knowledge, memory, personality traits, all of them could be displayed during a mediumistic seance. And this would be much better explained by the continuity of personality, survival personality, and possibility of communication than explained for example, telepathy or just unconscious mind activity. Okay, so this is, and then he came with the Spiritist theory that these phenomena are produced by extracorporeal intelligence, specifically for deceased personalities. Okay, and he claimed that this is a result of experience and observation. The only one that was able to give a rational explanation to all the facts of the cause. Of course, if we take some isolated facts, we could provide different explanations. And indeed, as I said previously, Kardec accepted that many of these so-called mediumistic phenomena are actually caused by hallucinations, unconscious mind activity, telepathy, but in many cases, this would not be possible. So the first moment in Kardec was this. First, to be convinced of the possibility to investigate survival after death, to have empirical evidence that could be investigated. So this, in reality, would be a huge achievement for mankind. The possibility of bringing a question that used to be considered only metaphysical, religious, philosophical, to bring it to an empirical level. So the first moment was when he became convinced the possibility of survival and the possibility of communication with deceased personalities, with the spirits. And after that, he moved to a second moment. How can we get reliable knowledge from these spirits? How can we get reliable knowledge about the spiritual realm. If we are now in touch with them, what can we learn? How can we learn? And to do this, he created a research program that he called Spiritism. And here is one of the definitions that Kardec wrote about Spiritism. Specifically here is in the book, What is Spiritism? This is indeed a very interesting book for those who want to have initial knowledge about Spiritism. This short book, What is Spiritism, is very useful because it was designed, it's just 100-page book, and Kardec exactly used this book to answer the most common questions that people have about Spiritism, the nature of Spiritism, how it was developed, and the main principles of Spiritism. So he defined Spiritism as a science that deals with nature, origins, and destiny of spirits, and their relation with the corporeal world. Okay, and the first report of his investigations was the book, The Spirit's Book. And after that, in 1858, he founded the Spiritist Society of Paris, and also he started the Revue Spirit, the Spiritist journal. He published books, had intense correspondence, and he devoted full-time the last 15 years of his life to Spiritism. And as I said previously, he raised several different explanations from mediumistic experience before being convinced that disembodied personality spirits could cause this experience. And his research guidelines. First, he searched for natural causes. Natural means based on laws of nature that could include non-corporeal beings. So non-corporeal beings would be part of the universe, like the microorganism, for example, like light. Even if you cannot see, they are part of the natural world. And it's important also to see that Kardec was not merely a compiler or codifier of mediumistic messages. He had a much more active role in the elaboration of Spiritism. And he emphasized pretty much a large and diversified empirical base. And his empirical base is basically composed by reports of mediumistic and other spiritual, transpersonal, psychic experiences. And he also developed criteria to raise and test theories, and as we discuss here. So, for example, he compared the spiritual world with the microscopic world. Before microscopes, people did not know, people were not aware of the existence of bacteria or of other microscopic beings. Despite that, they have influenced humanity since the beginning. And mediums were similar to microscopes, would help us to have access to this unseen aspect of reality. But as microscopes can also provide distorted information, specifically at that time when microscopes were not that good, there were several problems in microscopes. Mediums also can sometimes provide not reliable information, could provide be also a font of error. So he tried to collect all kinds of related phenomena: physical and mental mediumship, spontaneous case, seance, evocations, and things like that, and other sorts of spiritual experience. For example, near-death experience. Of course, there was not this word. Did not exist at that time, near-death experience. But he has reports of near-death experience, out-of-body experiences, telepathic experiences, and several other relevant psychic experiences to understand. And what were the sources of his observations? First, the Spiritist Society of Paris. They have regular meetings where they had different discussions. People brought writings, publications for other countries. They brought their own reports of other people, and also they had also mediumistic activities in the society. Also, he attended private seances. He also traveled to different countries, France, Belgium, Switzerland, to be in touch with different mediums, to collect different reports. And also he evoked the same personality through different mediums to see if there are some similarities, and ask sometimes the same questions to different mediums. In addition, he collected a huge number of reports of observations from other people, visitors. They received at the Spiritist Society of Paris visitors from all over the world. They went there, they made their reports. They also kept a worldwide correspondence network. It's impressive. He published in his published books, and the Revue Spirit, he published contacts with people from almost 300 cities in 37 different countries. So he kept an amazing volume of correspondence. And also he investigated historical texts and also current newspapers and books publishing these different things. For example, he investigated reports of mediumistic experiences in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, in ancient India, and also current and prevalent experience published in newspapers and books and things like that. And based on all these phenomena that he collected, we know, and he also knew, that science is more than just collecting data. It's impossible, is necessary to make sense of this data, to develop some theory on this. So it's essential to formulate a theoretical framework based on collected data. First, of course, he looked for a conventional explanation, the Occam's razor. So, of course, every time that he had a phenomena report, first he tried to verify the accuracy, the precision of, for example, it was very frequent. For example, he received a letter from a person from Moscow in Russia reporting some experience he observed with some medium. And then he asked for other of his contacts in Moscow, Russia, to also be in touch with that medium of that phenomena, to check, to have different reports of the same phenomena from different reliable witnesses. So this was one. And in raising the theory, sometimes the hypothesis came from Kardec himself, from other researchers, or sometimes by the spirits themselves, through mediums, they proposed the theory. And again, he said that we should be on guard against exaggerations from both credulity and skepticism, to try to find this tertium quid, this middle ground between credulity and exaggerated skepticism. This is one of his. And when some theory was proposed to explain some phenomena, he looked for empirical support. If there is supporting evidence, if there is no falsifying evidence. And also he looked for the logic and internal consistency of the theory. Like any other scientific theory, we looked for empirical evidence, supporting evidence. If there is no empirical data questioning the theory, and also what is the internal consistency, the logic inside that theory. This is what Kardec looked for, and also what he looked for, the simple theory, the simple, the better. And also the capacity to explain a large range of related phenomena. For example, when first he was convinced that there were deceased spirits, that they were able to communicate. For example, he started to question, what are they like? How do they appear? What kind of form or shape they have, if they have one? So he asked different mediums in trance to these communicating personalities, how do they appear? And also he asked to vident mediums, people who could see, who get visions. Sometimes mediums were able to see and describe a deceased person that they have never met, and they describe details very specific to that person. So, for example, in all these different ways to investigate the shape or the appearance of this medium, of these spirits, they converge to the idea that they have some kind of body, and this body, in some sense, was quite similar to the previous body that this personality had in his or her previous life. So to this body, he created a name, a body that involved the spirit, a pair spirit. Pair in Greek means around, so something that is around the spirit, a pair spirit. So this is the way in which he created the idea of pair spirit and the name for this spirit. Another example that he provided, for example, spirits who have not realized they are dead. So first he had conversation with the spirits who thought they were still alive in their physical bodies. This is also another example, another evidence about the perispirit, because if they did not see that they had some kind of body, they would realize that they were not alive anymore. But they report that they are seeing their own bodies. And the same report obtained through a number of mediums unknown to each other. So different mediums from different places report similar communications of a communicating spirit claiming that they are still alive. And then Kardec concluded that this was a stage of the spiritual life. And then he studied the patterns of this manifestation. For example, usually were ethically less advanced spirits who had sudden death. And also it was usually a transitory state. Sooner or later, they would realize that they were not in flesh anymore. So this is one example of how this theory developed based on empirical observation. And in addition, this theory must be progressive, must be able to incorporate new theses and revise its own when necessary. For example, Kardec denied the beginning the possibility of spirit possession. He believed that the deceased spirit could only make some influence in the medium's body, on a person's body, but could not actually take full control, possess in that sense. And he published this, and he wrote this in the Medium's book, for example, in 1861. But later, he published at the Revue Spirit, the Spiritist journal, several examples of actual possession. And he acknowledges in a paper, a very interesting paper, if I'm not wrong, in December in 1863, a case about Miss Julia, a medium who had a full possession trance, and he recognized he acknowledged there that he did not believe previously in possession, in true possession, and this case is one example of many others that had convinced him to change his mind. And then he changed the idea and started to accept the idea of possession in Spiritism. So this is one example. Another example is regarding reincarnation. The idea of reincarnation was first proposed by some mediums in trance. The communicating personality claimed that there existed a reincarnation. Kardec himself was against the idea of reincarnation, but later, because of several reasons, he accepted the idea of reincarnation. For example, it was the best explanation for the difference in personalities and skills in very young children who share the same environment, who share sometimes the same genetics, but very different styles, genius, for example, and also memories from previous lives, and also in addition, the best way to understand the justice of God. So, based on different aspects, he incorporated the idea of reincarnation to Spiritism. And finally, to open the floor for discussions, this is just an explanatory study to help us to understand who Kardec was and what was his main method of investigation and how he developed the theory of Spiritism. So he was a pioneer researcher on mediumship and psychic phenomena, one of the first to propose a scientific approach to a subject, spirituality, that used to be considered metaphysical or unsuitable for an empirical and rational investigation. He advanced the main contemporary theories to explain paranormal phenomena, as I said previously. He produced very informative discussions on epistemological and methodological aspects of scientific exploration of psychical phenomena. But more studies are necessary in this sense. And exactly to help this, we here at the Federal University of Juiz de Fora in Brazil, we launched recently a portal called Allan Kardec's Project. And in this portal, we are making freely available original and unpublished original writings from Kardec. His own handwriting and the transcription of we make available at this website, at this portal, the image, the scanned image of the letters, of his own notes, the transcription to French, and also the translation to Portuguese. Soon, we will also make it available also in English. We are working on that. But also, in addition, if you go through bibliography here we have references, several of them in English, academic reference about Allan Kardec. If you click here in bibliography, you will be able to see several academic works about Kardec, including a paper that we published summarizing much of what we had presented here in this presentation. Here is the website, projetokardec.ufjf.br. You just click here and go there. And also, I'd like to thank you very much. Here are also a YouTube channel, the TV Lupis is our YouTube channel for our research group, where we have hundreds of videos, many of them also available in English, about spirituality, science, and health. People from philosophy, history, neuroscience, from many different universities, from Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, University of São Paulo, University of Juiz de Fora, discussing different aspects of spirituality and science, and also our social networks if someone would like to be in touch. Thank you very much for this opportunity to be here. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both of you, for such wonderful talks today. I'm so pleased to be able to attend. Could I ask you, while we're waiting for questions to come in, can I ask each of you, with regard to the paranormal and reincarnation and spirit possession, how does it link with the experiences of people who find themselves in psychiatric hospitals and labelled with a disorder? How does these paranormal events, how does it relate to those who find themselves at the attention of psychiatrists? Who would like to go first?
Dr. Alexander, would you like to take that one?
No, you can start, and then
I can say it from a personal, because it'd be very hard for me to say that I have worked in mental health, but I would put that in the context of my own experiences, because that's more reliable to me. And I went through an extreme state in 1986. And after living in a Buddhist monastery, I had what might be termed a classic Kundalini awakening, where I had a beautiful epiphany. Then I went down into some difficult stuff, but I had no sense of ego groundedness to be able to hold the experience. And I was able to, fortunately, I met somebody who was very good at spotting what I was in. And he said, if you can get through this, it will transform you. It took me 2 years to get through the epicenter of it. But what happened was, and I won't go into details because it's a little bit, it's rather unpleasant, a lot of it, but I was getting all sorts of things. I was getting feelings of cobwebs on my face. I was getting real sense of intrusion. And I think because the complex that I was in was so manifest, I now see it that I was probably drawing spirits that were agitating me because I was in a very extreme state and it was very difficult. And to be quite honest with you, if I'd have probably been seen by a psychiatrist back then, I probably would have been invited to have some time in a hospital to sort myself out. I was in a very, very difficult place. I managed to get through it, and it took me many years after that, doing lots of psychotherapy, to start working out all of the Jungian type. I did a Jungian type psychotherapy training to work out all these internal difficulties. And I look back on it now and I think, good Lord, you know, that could have been sliding doors. That could have been acute admissions. It actually became part of my awakening. It took many, many years. So I can only look at it now. And I think I look at people's difficulties through that lens, that there could be all manner of stuff that's coming up for them, trauma that's very personal and very difficult, but then getting amplified by spirits that might be agitating them. And, you know, it's certainly been, I think, my experience anyway. So I don't know if that answers the question, Natalie. It says, but that's what happened to me.
Okay, that's good. Thank you, Dr. Alexander. Would you like to say, with your experience in psychiatry?
Yeah. My PhD was exactly investigating mental health of mediums and how can we make the distinction between healthy spiritual experiences from mental disorders. Actually, until a few decades ago, mediumistic experiences, spiritual experiences as a whole, tended to be considered as pathological expressions, as indicators of mental disorder or the cause of mental disorder. This was a big problem in many places around the world. On the other side, we are not aware, even in psychiatry, in mainstream psychiatry, we have worked a lot at the World Psychiatric Association, American Psychiatric Association, even the Royal College of Psychiatrists in UK are open to the possibility that spiritual experiences can be healthy and that people can have auditory and visionary experiences and then can be useful to people. So there has been a lot of discussions in how can we make the distinctions when they are mental disorder, when they are healthy. This is one point. But on the other side, also, it's important to keep in mind that in saying that quite often people can have spiritual experience that can sometimes be mistook as mental disorders, it's important also to avoid the extreme opposite. People who deny mental disorders or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder claim that everything is just a spiritual experience. This is also very harmful. Also, we need to avoid both extremes. Actually, I prefer in my actual practice to have a biopsychosocial spiritual approach, integrating everything. Sometimes we need to use medication, we need to use psychotherapy, people can have spiritual support. So it's important to not one thing or other approach, but sometimes it's much more useful to use one approach and other different approaches altogether.
All right, thank you. I'm going to read some of the questions from the comments. And here is one from Anna Paula Telles. One of the difficulties to study mediumship scientifically is to provide friendly conditions to the mediums and repeat and control the experiments. How do you deal with that? And is there a protocol that other scientists can do the same?
Very good question, Anna. Yeah, we just published last month at the scientific journal Explore a paper where we investigate in very strict conditions, mediums, and we discuss exactly the limitations, the problems of a too artificial condition too artificial condition could impair the possibility of real investigating media. So it's quite tricky situation to find a balance, a good compromise between have a more ecologically valid environment, as we say this in science, and at the same time to have some possibility to have some scientific control. There are different ways. We are now performing a study with mediums who do automatic writing. They write automatic psychographic letters. And for example, we are inviting them to come to our city, and then we provide a quite friendly environment to them. But at the same time, we have some controls and monitoring which kind of contact the medium has with the sitter, and then we can evaluate how much information leakage happened, for example, in some situations.
All right. Thank you. Mick, do you want to add anything?
Just a brief one. It comes back to Jung. He actually did study, his doctoral studies was on occult phenomena. And Helena Priestbeck, I think that's how you say her name, was, I think, his cousin. And he studied, she was a brilliant medium and was coming out with some fantastic things. And Jung got very excited about this. But they started applying lots of pressure on her. And I think this pertains to the question. And all of a sudden, her gift dried up. But then she started to perform out of sort of an anxiety, a sort of profession, a pressure to perform, and the anxiety. And then she started making it up because she wanted to please people. And Jung sort of got into a real tiz with it, and he left it. He thought, oh, that he couldn't trust it after that. But I actually think if they'd have been a bit more sensitive to her and her gift, that might have been a very different outcome.
And regarding this study from Jung with his cousin, there is a recent paper from Sono Chandanzani, one of the best historians that we have nowadays in psychology and also Jung. And he analyzed exactly how Jung changed his own perception about the mediumistic experience with his cousin based on Jung's on changes throughout his life. So sometimes he thought that this mediumistic experience was just the unconscious activity. Sometimes he was more open to accept that it was an actual mediumistic communication. But Jung himself also had some personal mediumistic experience, and also he investigated other mediums.
Yes, yes. He even had he got into a terrible affect on a train once, and started having an experience of feeling he was drowning. And one of his grandchildren was actually drowning at that time. Very, very, yeah. I also want to say, going back, I shared my experience here earlier, and I forgot to say, because I was thinking about other things, but I also have times where I get quite mediumistic experiences happening, mainly through dreams. They're quite prophetic. And so I think what I went through was an opening of some of that experience. Just wanted to put that in because I didn't say it earlier. But I think these things are rumbling around as part of our individuation. I think many of us have these abilities. And for me, they're very low key. I think Jung they were quite strong. But yeah, he had very prophetic visions and dreams.
Yes, indeed. And we have another question from Kausa Kohan, who says, how is psychiatric medication impacting consciousness, spiritual evolution, and innate healing? How does psychiatric medication impact on consciousness, spiritual evolution, and innate healing? Who would like to speak first?
I don't know. Do you want to go, Alexander?
Okay. I think it depends. If the psychiatric medication is well used, it would be very helpful to impact consciousness and spiritual evolution. If, for example, a patient has a severe depression, a psychotic crisis or a bipolar or manic episode, for example, it's quite useful to use medications. Very essential to stabilize the person, help the person to stabilize, and then to develop it, to go through his or her own spiritual path. So it used in good way to be very useful. But of course, like anything, if it's misused, if it's used just to avoid go deeper in deeper existential or spiritual questions, or there is misdiagnosis of a healthy or a spiritual emergence, if it's mistaken as a mental disorder, this could be also a problem.
Mm. Yeah, I've seen it used very helpfully in the short term, and you think, yeah, great, because somebody's very agitated and upset, and I've seen medication used and it's been very helpful. I've also seen it being used long term and people getting secondary symptoms, tardive dyskinesia and things like that, and it's shocking. And I think it does have a terrible impact. And surely, I think we're coming to that point now where there's a real urge and impetus for us to find that ground of helping people in an extreme acute state, but also then to go further with the recovery process, and not just recovering some everyday identity, unless that's what the person wants, but also that this could be implicating a journey of wholeness and individuation. And yet our narratives in our hospitals are not set up for that. They're often quite short-term, interventions with maybe CBT, and I'm not anti-CBT, it's seen it used well, but actually just to help people have some sort of incremental sense of journey through a long period of time, maybe, where that wholeness could be honored. Let's take that as default, that we have a wholeness, and maybe the mental health system can actually help that process happen. It might take a long time, and there could be many gradations on the way, medication, bit of CBT, bit of body work, and but when I worked as a therapist in mental health, I always tried to do myself out of a job. And I've worked with many people and I've actually got them out of the system. I mean, that has happened, and we work very deeply and carefully, but that happened. So I've seen it.
Mick, I completely agree that we need to go further. And even in current mainstream psychiatry, there is a huge discussion nowadays about human flourishing. How can we promote flourishing, increasing, growing wisdom? So this is some important aspects. But sometimes, or quite often also, it's necessary to keep using medication for a long period, depending on some situations or in some diagnoses that some people have. It's essential to keep using for a long time medication, but it does not mean that it is enough. That's the point. We don't need to see this different approach as competing, but all of them should be used in a sensitive way, as needed. I think that's the main point.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. Yeah, I'm not anti-medication. I've seen it used very well, and but in the absence of other things, I think it can be very detrimental. And
I think we do need a lot of collaboration, ongoing collaboration and training between people who have different perspectives on so-called symptoms. We do need that. We have a question here from Joe Bartholomew, who said, for Mick Collins, could we have more details on your book?
That's very kind of you, Joe. That's very, very sweet of you to make a segue. I'm actually writing a book at the moment where Jung and Kardec are featured in the book quite strongly. It's not an academic piece. It's more of a, there's lots of references, but it's called The Restorative Spirit. And I'm looking at restoring that sense of wholeness and, what that takes and what are the narratives in there. There's sort of a lot of what I spoke about today. So some of those regrets that we might have for actions past committed that we've done, and how we might move forward and actually forgive ourselves and forgive others. Because, sometimes the traumas that we have in our life are one thing, but the layering and the complexities of other overlays that impact on that, guilt, shame, the lack of forgiveness and all those things. So I think really, I think this is the time for a really freshen up of our sense of what's possible as restorative spirits. What is it that will help us all move forward, irrespective of our circumstances and who we are. I mean, like I say, 30 odd years ago, I could easily have ended up in hospital, and I won't go into what some of the thought processes were going on, but they were quite paranoid and they were all over the place. I could have ended up with all manner of things, but with deep psychotherapy for many years, about 10 years, that helped enormously to work through that, and training as a therapist myself. So that idea of restoration, and I think Kardec offers us some really useful things in terms of the moral position, and I think Jung gives us some great insights from the transpersonal position in consciousness. So, it'll be coming out hopefully next year or the year after when I've written it. But thank you, Joe.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Daniel Pion, who says, could anybody talk about the current studies that are happening in universities around spiritism?
I think that's yours, Alexander. No.
There are several groups who have investigated different aspects of spiritual experience, and specifically also regarding the spiritism. There are some studies, as we are conducting now here at Federal University of Juiz de Fora with mediums. We investigated previously mental health of mediums and how to differentiate between mental disorders and health mediumistic experiences. But more recently, we are investigating mediumistic experience itself and if it provides or not evidence of spiritual information. So we have papers on Chico Xavier and other mediums in this stuff. There is also a group at the University of São Paulo, at the Institute of Psychiatry of the University of São Paulo. They are also investigating spiritual therapies, therapies that are developed also in Spiritist psychiatric hospitals. They also investigated this kind of experience. I think that there is a growing interest in academic environment exploring different facets of spirituality and specifically spiritist experience and spiritist practices. And there is also another study, also University of São Paulo, about the complementary health assistance provided by spiritist centers in São Paulo. So they investigated thousands of cases of spiritist practices complementary to regular health treatments, for example.
Thank you. There's also University of Northampton have got a big scientific studies, and University of Wales in Lampeter, people like Jack Hunter, Chris Rowe, David Luke. There are people doing those studies in the UK.
Yeah. And in addition, just remembering, Axel Kardec at Lund University in Sweden is also doing investigations of this sort, and specifically also in the United States, University of Virginia. University of Virginia has the Division of Perceptual Studies, who has performed this sort of investigation for more than 50 years. And different groups investigating.
They are, thank you. And we have another question from Lucas, who says, it seems that Spiritism is compatible, in quotes, with Christianity. It acknowledges the ongoing, very important role of Jesus Christ. But what about other religions and their most important figures? Are they also mentioned in the Spiritist literature?
Well, I remember reading about Socrates. I think Kardec certainly flags up Socrates and his connection with his spirit guide, or daemon, as the Greeks would call it. I don't recall anything on Buddhism or Hinduism or anything like that. I read the 5 volumes quite recently, but what I think is interesting, if you look at the sort of Jesus' injunction to love one another, you know, there's the 10 commandments, then there's love, and love each other as I've loved you, and all that. And then you look at in Buddhism, you've got the 6 perfections, the 6 paramitas. They're very compatible with that. And I think you start to look at all the world religions about being just, charitable, loving, kind. You realize there's a great compatibility with it. Now, I'm not a scholar of spiritism or anything. I'm just somebody who's read the books and thought this is really interesting and quite enlivening. So I'm going to hand over to Alexander because he might know a lot more than I do.
Yeah, Allan Kardec talked, for example, a lot about Socrates, for example. But yeah, in the Spiritist works in modern mediums like Chico Xavier, Divaldo Franco, yeah, definitely there are references to Buddha, to Hinduism, to Jewish traditions, to very different traditions. The idea basically in Spiritism is that enlightened spirits have reincarnated in different contexts, different times, different cultures to help to advance humanity. So definitely yes.
Yeah, and there's also material from Australian Aboriginal people, from different peoples of Africa, from Indigenous American people who all have a perspective on Spiritism. So that there's plenty of stuff, whether it's written about in the literature in the West is another question. My background's medical anthropology, so I'm looking at other things. We've got another question, and there's one I'd like to look at, but from Idalina Souza, which department in USB has been working in the spiritual field, especially mediumship?
Yeah, USP, University of São Paulo, Department of Psychiatry. Department of Psychiatry has had for more than 20 years a program to investigate spirituality and psychiatry. Department of Psychiatry.
All right, thank you. There is another question here from Jeanette Werman, and she says, while using ayahuasca in the context of Santo Daime, I experienced being taken over by the spirit of a child my mother had aborted before I was born. He let me feel his distress as he needed his pain to be acknowledged and witnessed before he could move on. Can I ask if either of you have something like this that you've come across in your studies?
Wow, that's really rich. I don't personally, but I totally resonate with that, because when you start going into you know, spirits that are in the disincarnate realms, let's say, I think all manner of connections are trying to be made, and I made very brief reference to the one of Saint Pio, Padre Pio. A spirit came to him and said, I'm in distress. I burnt down, before this place became a monastery, I burnt down room 4 because I was smoking in bed and I shouldn't have been. It was a hostel at that time. And I caused all manner of damage. And anyway, this poor person was in distress. He said, I'll say a mass for you. He blessed him and the spirit went. And then he went down to the public records office with another monk, and all the details were recorded as the spirit had told them. So when Jeanette talks about something like that, I naturally go, yeah, why not? You know, that this spirit is coming along and seeking some sort of work through Jeanette in that moment. Yes, but I don't have any other tangible examples other than the one I've given.
All right.
In the spiritist literature, it's very frequent to have reports of people who were distressed or disturbed because of abortion. So people who, the unborn child who was aborted, quite often this spirit can be in some sense disturbed and need to be supported and helped. There are several of these discussions or descriptions in Spiritist literature.
It's a powerful question.
Wow. Yes, thank you. We do have another one. I think this is going to be the last question before we pull this together. It's from Jo Allison, and she said, in her personal experience, it's up now. In her personal experience, the crisis was such an important part of the awakening, recognizing the deepening that happens as we go within to face ourselves. She says, I lost my sight 11 years ago, and it had so many impacts of physical, mental, and emotional. And the recovery for her included a huge spiritual awakening, and being in the darkness and literally into my shadow led to an extraordinary expansion in awareness. My mediumistic abilities grew with all my other senses as I navigated through. Do either of you had any comments on that from Jo?
Well, yeah, I think Jung would love that, Jo. What a story. I mean, wow, so powerful. But I think that typifies what Jung is bringing to this narrative, that, you know, what we would see primarily as a disturbance and something shocking and something difficult, when you enter into it, all of a sudden starts to reveal its own gifts and its own expanse, and that you move into that wholeness. And for me, you know, the mediumistic stuff that you said started to come with that. I think that does happen, and whatever way that mediumistic ability happens for us, for some it's in dreams, for some it's in sort of intuition, and, you know, many ways it can happen, automatic writing. But what's interesting for me is in this time of global crisis, where we are being, if you wish, pulled down into some depths and darkness at this moment, the idea that somehow we should just try and just raise it all up and keep it as normal seems insanity to me. It seems that somehow there's got to be a way to go, and like you would in shamanistic cultures, and as we've heard before, the indigenous cultures, to go down and honor those experiences and find where they're resonating in terms of our journey forward. I did a lot of studies with Arnold Mindell et al. With process-oriented psychology, and, you know, I worked on my spiritual crisis in that context. And similarly to you, what came out of that was a much greater resonance with a sense of wholeness and what that means going forward. And it doesn't mean to say we're all going to have the same experiences, but just honoring the fact that this is a process that we're in, and we're very much needing it in this day and age. I think this is going to become critical. I wrote a paper on this about 11 years ago, saying this is going to be the enantiodromia of this time. There's going to be a flip. Consensus reality is going to start eroding, and much more of the depths are going to become apparent to us. How we resource ourselves with that going forward is going to be everything. And I think your beautiful summary there just illustrates perfectly the journey that many of us are going to go through in all of our unique and individual ways.
Thank you, Mick. Can I ask you each to say one sentence about morality, global morality, and spiritism? Just one sentence, and then I'll ask Elsa to come in and say a closing few words about global morality rather than individual.
Alexander, do you want to start?
I think that one of the, perhaps the main message of Spiritism in terms of global morality is the idea that we all are spirits having terrestrial experiences, and each moment in each place that we are in terms of sex, race, culture, social position is just an opportunity for that moment, and then we can change all positions. If we have this broader perspective that we are actually the same in nature, I think this would have a huge ethical implication for universal fraternity.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Mick.
Yeah, a lot of people ask me why I've gone public with my messy stories, and the reason is because if we have a culture where we're thinking everybody else is all right and it's just me that's the problem, we'll never move on. So, you know, part of sharing and self-sharing is going, you know, it's one of the reasons why I talk about the extreme state. I talk about my criminal record. It's actually because morality is about saying, you know, I've done wrong somewhere. And if any of us think we haven't done wrong, ecocide is a major problem, and we've all got our fingerprints on that one. So let's be honest with ourselves. First of all, morality is about honesty, but it's about not blame and condemnation. It's about forgiveness. So first we forgive ourselves, and then we can open a space in our hearts to move forward. It makes me feel very emotional talking about this. We can make a space to go forward. This objective world that we've inherited for the last 300 or 400 years has done us no favors. It's helped us with some great science, but it's cut us off from being honest with who we are. So morality is about saying, yeah, this is who I am. I have dirt on my hands too, like the dream that Jung dealt with. I'm going to clean them up, and I'm going to try and move forward. And I think there you have the Jungian position and the Spiritist position in a nutshell, because it is a moral imperative this time. And how we treat other species, how we treat others, and how we treat our own histories is critical.
All right, thank you. Thank you both for coming in on Kardec's birthday to give such wonderful talks. Elsa, would you like to make some closing comments? And unmute yourself. Would you unmute yourself, Elsa?
It's done. Okay, thank you all for being here with us. Thank you all our great friends and speakers, Dr. Alexander, Dr. Mick Collins, and our dear Natalie, Dr. Natalie for us, that is the Secretary of the British Spiritist Medical Association, a joint partnership with the BAS, working and disseminating Spiritist scientific points of view and studies in the UK. And we are pleased to say once again, thank you, Kardec, for bringing to us these beautiful teachings that nowadays are a guideline for life. Thank you all for being with us once again. And please follow me in a little closing prayer. Saying, thank you, dear Lord. Thank you, our dear benefactors, our guardians angels, that you are surrounding us 24/7. That we are so happy that we can really talk about the spirit, about everything that are inside us openly, exchanging idea. Thank you, dear guardian angels, for being part of our family, surrounding us every day, our pathway to light. May your blessing be with all of us and help us to maintain ourselves in serenity, in peace and love. Thank you all. So be it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can you stay in background for a while, please? We are 2 minutes to the end. That is really good. So nice questions, really good. So we hope to, the 28th of November, we will be on Facebook with Arun Gandhi. It's a grandson of our dear Mahatma Gandhi that will be talking to us, to our friends, about the 12 lessons of Gandhi. Okay? Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.